Hello, and welcome to the AI and Data Ethics lecture series. This is our fifth class, which actually is the second part of the second lecture. I'm Paula Boddington. So here we're going to continue our discussion about practical ethics, guidelines and policy. And we're going to start by hearing a little bit more from Alan MacDonald, from whom we heard in the last class.
What really surprised me was that when the management of my company came back on a half hour later on the teleconference, it wasn't the vice president of engineering anymore who made the recommendation not to launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. It was my boss, the vice president of Space Booster Programs, head of program management. And he said that they had reassessed all of their data and they have concluded that it's okay to proceed with the launch as planned. No restrictions at all, no temperature requirement whatsoever. Well, NASA's reaction was that they accepted that without any question, but they needed that recommendation put in writing and signed by a responsible Thiokol official. Well, I knew who that responsible Thiokol official was. That was me. That's why I was there. And I made the smartest decision I ever made in my lifetime. I refused to sign it.
In the first video clip from the last short section of his lecture that we saw before, Alan MacDonald spoke about the process that ultimately led to the decision to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger in temperatures so low that the O-ring seals failed, exactly as the engineers had predicted, causing the loss of 7 lives, including those of Krista McAuliffe. Krista McAuliffe flew as part of a Teacher in Space program, which also only added to the trauma because amongst those watching were millions of American schoolchildren. In this clip, MacDonald explained how at one stage a process was overseen not by engineers as requested, but by management, and there was a request for him to sign in what is known colloquially as passing the buck, trying to get a particular individual to take responsibility. So the entire sorry episode illustrates a key question about the process of attributing responsibility amongst a large chain of people within organisations. And this is going to be a key question in lots of areas, but including in AI and data ethics. Good for him that he had the guts not to sign, and we must all fervently hope that none of us ever face such a momentous decision. But it's more than likely that something more minor will cross our paths, possibly many, many times. And it's important to think about the pressures that can lead people to comply with bad decision making. As we shall see throughout the course, questions of human responsibility and of moral agency are amongst the most pressing of all the questions raised in AI ethics, and we'll be hearing from MacDonald later on. So, what are the learning outcomes for today? Well, hopefully, I hope you learn at least one thing. We're going to consider what lessons for AI and data ethics might be learned from other areas of professional ethics. We're going to be looking particularly at medicine. We're going to look at the institutional settings of ethics and ways in which this might hinder the proper functioning of codes of ethics. We're going to consider the role of both individual factors and social factors, look at particular issues that might arise in relation to technology, and consider what role philosophy might have and what the contributions of other disciplines could be. So, when we look at professional guidelines, what can AI learn from other areas? When I was trying to find a picture to illustrate this point, I gathered together some books from my parents' old bookcase of various practical things you could do. They come from a pretty practical sort of family. And when I looked at them as a collection, I realised that they illustrate something really quite important about things which might seem to be simple instructions, simple practical how-to instructions. They often have a really important, interesting history in relation to both technology and in relation to government guidance. So if we look at these, let's just illustrate this quickly. The green one, tea and tea making, I discovered amongst my father's things. He was a school teacher. It's a really fascinating leaflet, actually, a short little leaflet produced by the government in the early 1950s when tea rationing had only just finished, and it was issued to domestic science teachers to teach the nation's school children how to make tea properly, how to make a decent cup of tea. Nothing could be more important. So the government wanted to encourage people to start drinking tea again when they'd been drinking absolutely terrible tea or hardly any of it for so many years. But the silver book next to it, you probably can't read all the title properly. The Way to a Good Table, Electric Cookery by Elizabeth Craig. This belonged to my mother's stepmother from the 1930s, and it was issued by the Electricity Council specifically to encourage people to adopt this newfangled technology of electric cookery. You'll also see, for example, a dark red book, Ilford Films Manual of Photography. That's got a really interesting relationship to technology as well, because a lot of the stuff in that book is still completely valid. Optics doesn't change. Light still travels in straight lines, still goes through lenses in the same kind of way. But a lot of the rest of it is now out of date because it was from the time it was produced in the 1960s when everybody was using old-fashioned emulsion film photography. So, but also something really interesting about that as well, which is that that's actually coming back into vogue as people realise that digital photography has got many, many advantages, but film photography has got its own pleasures and own attributes that you might very well want to exploit. So what we're going to do now is to look in some detail at professional guidance in the area of medical ethics. AI ethics is often compared with medical ethics, and there are some instructive parallels, but also really importantly, some considerable differences. One reason for looking at medical ethics, though, of course, because it's such an important part of our lives, and the notion of professional ethics is really, really well integrated into the practice of medicine, and also alongside medicine and medical ethics, there's a whole very mature discipline of people scrutinising medicine. There's, as well as medical ethics, there's philosophy of medicine, there's medical sociology, medical anthropology, and an awful lot of public interest. So it's a mature discipline that's going to be really useful to compare with AI ethics, and it's also got a really interesting history. Well, obviously, in a sense, medical ethics can be said to be something which has happened ever since the practice of medicine. So it's always a moot point as to where to start history. And as again, we're only going to be doing a little snapshot. But it's impossible to talk about the history of medical ethics, certainly in the 20th century, without talking about the Second World War, because this was at least a very large turning point. We should note that ethical rules and guidelines are often drawn up or modified in response to disasters, atrocities, and extremely clear wrongdoing. We might actually sometimes consider what might happen if they were drawn up in response to examples of extremely good behaviour. But it's certainly the case that the sorry history of medical experimentation during the Second World War formed a turning point in the development of medical ethics. This here on this slide is a memorial to the Sinti and Roma who were tortured and murdered. I took this in Sachsenhausen concentration camp just outside Berlin. Sinti and Roma were subjected to measurements in so-called racial assessments, anthropomorphic measurements, and experiments of the utmost cruelty were carried out upon this site and elsewhere during the Second World War, medical experiments which have become notorious for their horror. So this is a photograph from a famous Nuremberg doctors' trial. And while we're on this point, I would just mention one impact of the Second World War on moral philosophy. Philosophy, at least in the English-speaking part of the world, had taken a turn where it focused very much on abstract questions and on questions of language and analysis, and this included moral philosophy. The idea that philosophers could find some truth in ethics and that they might be able to say something that had practical import, once a hope of many philosophers, had been pretty much put to one side. But World War II changed all that. Perceptive people amongst you will realise that this illustration is from a First World War cemetery, but nonetheless it illustrates the point. How, in the face of the evils of the Second World War, could philosophers carry on claiming that ethics was nothing they could say about, that there was nothing they could say about good and evil? How could they carry on claiming that universal values did not exist? And some of the earliest work in practical ethics, at least again I'm talking from the English-speaking tradition, some of the earliest work in practical ethics can be seen as starting in the 1940s and the 1950s, for example in the work of the philosophers Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot, who were both at Somerville College, Oxford. We also have to examine really closely the question of the universality of values in ethics of AI, for many reasons, partly because of the global reach of much AI and because of the international nature of many of the tech corporations, and the concentration of AI and AI ethics into a small part of the world's population, at least currently. From the Nuremberg trials arose the Nuremberg Code, the first point of which is that voluntary consent is essential. One of the things we need to think about in relation to AI and data ethics is indeed consent and various notions of consent as it's developed in particular contexts, and how this might apply to the use of technology. We also need to think about the link of consent to ideas about agency and control, which we'll be looking at in future lectures. Many developments have come out since the Nuremberg Code. For example, the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, Ethical Principles for Medical Research Involving Human Subjects, which has been updated many, many times. And it's generally considered, or at least it has been considered in most contexts, that where medical research is concerned, that ethical principles should be even tighter than in normal medical practice. The development of medical ethics involved a great many different factors, which I've listed some of the main factors here, which we can think about and compare and contrast with the state of AI ethics and what might be learnt from medical ethics. So, the development of medical ethics as it's practiced now includes, for example, professional regulation and registration of anybody working in the medical field, developments in medical law, which take place both locally and also with international precedents. There are various sanctions for poor behaviour, up to and including loss of professional status, disciplinary action, loss of professional status, and of course actually up to improving fines and imprisonment. There's broad international agreement with local variation in some details. There has also been grown up regulations from the pharmaceutical industry. So the pharmaceutical industry obviously is incredibly important for the regulation of the practice of medicine. There's actually been quite a lot of pressure from within medicine on the pharmaceutical industry. So, for example, Marcia Angel, who for many years was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, has done a lot of work pushing for tighter regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. So there's been pressure from academic medical publishing. So if you're doing a clinical trial, you can only get it published if it follows various high standards, and those standards include steps to try to prevent the suppression of negative results, for example. Around this, there are very strong patient interest groups which have grown up. That shows a bit of complexity, actually, because patient interest groups are often funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm not by any means saying that all this is perfect, but I'm just talking about a reasonably healthy and reasonably robust ecosystem around a practice of medicine, which goes to help to keep it reasonably high ethical standards. In particular, of great relevance to us, there's regulations regarding patient data. So a couple of lectures ago, I mentioned how DeepMind had got into trouble doing some research of the Royal Free Hospital because DeepMind the Royal Free was at fault as well, but DeepMind had somehow forgotten to check that maybe regulations around patient data and confidentiality might be particularly strict. Now, there are different areas of medical ethics as well. So, for example, clinical ethics, which dealing with particular patients, but also public health ethics, which has got a slightly different set of values because it's geared towards the health of the population as a whole. I think recording this as I am in the pandemic, then you can see that there will be debates about, say, individual patients' benefits in terms of medical treatment and maybe vaccination versus what might be the case, what might be best for public health ethics. And there are standards also for nursing ethics and for allied staff. So that gives you some introduction of the kinds of culture and, say, surrounding social setting for the development of medical ethics. So we could think about what might be helpful and what we might be able to translate into the area of AI and data ethics, and what AI and data ethics might still have missing. So there has grown up a very robust body of academic scrutiny and work surrounding the practice of medicine, and we're going to look at a few examples. So here are just a few of my favourite books around medicine, which I've selected to illustrate some of the interesting work that's grown up around medicine from different disciplines, but also to think about the kinds of things we might be able to learn from, or the sorts of work that might be needed in relation to AI and data ethics. So we have not just medical ethics, but we have philosophy of medicine and people working in different allied fields like sociology and anthropology, and different branches of medicine examining the social determinants of medicine. So let's just look at a few of these. So starting on the right, the blue book, Social Determinants of Health by Michael Marmot. This is about the Marmot's rightly famous Whitehall studies, a brilliantly designed set of studies looking at the social determinants of health by examining, called the Whitehall studies because they were examining hierarchy within the workplace setting in the public service. And there have been made some incredibly interesting and worthwhile studies about the impacts of hierarchy, of social class, and of stress, of workplace stress on health. So, for example, they've recently discovered actually the molecular mechanisms behind the ways in which workplace stress can directly cause coronary artery disease. And some of this, of course, notions about health and well-being in relation to work and technology is going to be really critically important when we're talking about AI and data and the future of work, which we're going to be looking at later on towards the end of the course. The grey book there by Ivan Illich in the middle, Limits to Medicine. Again, another really, really incredibly important book, Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health, where he talked about the notion of iatrogenic disease. In other words, disease and conditions caused by the practice of medicine itself, if you like, a kind of own goal of medicine. And some such concept could be very useful and very valuably extrapolated to other areas of technology and to perhaps the use of AI and data, how we might be using it in ways which actually is really counterproductive and maybe some ways doing the reverse of what it was that we wanted it to do. Up at the top, we've got Barbara Katz-Rothman's book, The Tentative Pregnancy, How Amniocentesis Changes the Experience of Motherhood. Again, a really fascinating and important book, and one which is directly about how the impact of technology can really have a major impact on something which we might see to be one of the most central human experiences. Of course, we're not all mothers, but we were all born. And she's examined how the experience of going through amniocentesis can change how women feel about their own pregnancies. So we can see how technology can change actually how we see our relationships with each other, how we see, importantly, how we see, in this case, how we see our relationships with our own bodies. And the general notions of medicalisation, which runs through a few of these texts. The notion of medicalisation is broadly the idea that a problem is seen in medical terms and therefore requiring a medical solution, which could perhaps on many occasions be questioned. So a problem might manifest itself as a medical solution, but perhaps it's actually more accurately or more usefully seen as being a social solution or a social problem or a psychological problem. Or perhaps even if something is a medical problem, we don't necessarily we might not necessarily be best off trying to look for a medical solution. And likewise in technology, especially as technology is taking over so much of our lives, especially as we're seeing so much through computers and through technology in relation to data and AI, we can easily go down the road of assuming that the problems that it's produced are simply technological problems and the solutions which we need are simply technological solutions. Now, if you go and look at the red book in the corner, The Tyranny of Health by Michael Fitzpatrick. Michael Fitzpatrick is a London GP, and in The Tyranny of Health, it's a book that all of these books are going to be controversial to some extent, a book where he's asking the question whether or not health is really the ultimate value that we should be pursuing at all costs and in all instances. Actually, a question which many people have been asking during the pandemic. And again, of course, this is controversial. One of the reasons why it's important to think about this in relation to AI is in relation to what the goals of a piece of technology might be. Again, we can easily get captured by the capacity to do something, the capacity to bring about health, the capacity to extend life, the capacity to use technology in all sorts of ways. We then have to stop and pause to think, are we pursuing this value too much? Can we have too much of a good thing? Are there other values that we're losing at the same time? And then lastly, up in the corner in the blue, again, Irving Goffman's classic work, Asylums, essays on the social situation of mental patients and other inmates. Goffman calls these patients inmates. He's thinking about why to do that. He's not doing it by accident. He talks about the total institution. And we also really need to think about this in relation to AI and data, and in relation to, for example, about how our technology is being produced. It's being produced within large corporations. Corporations, of course, are institutions. So Irving Goffman is looking really closely at how the impact of the institution, and again, also the impact of hierarchy within institution and what particular social role you have within institution, can have a huge impact on how we behave. And actually, if we remember the points we've just been discussing about the pressures on people to conform and to behave in certain ways, this kind of work is really critical to bring to bear, to think about what's going on as AI and data is being produced and analysed and used. So now we could think about how all this feeds back into philosophy and how philosophy could contribute to these interdisciplinary discussions. And there are several ways. For example, social scientists' work can uncover issues of ethical concern, such as the existence and nature of health disparities, or changes in how women think about pregnancy, as we have just seen in the work of Barbara Katz-Rothman. And work in medical ethics can then investigate these questions in further detail. Much of the work in other disciplines, in other social science disciplines in particular, uncovers a great deal of nuance behind some key value concepts. So, for example, if you look at what informed consent looks like in practice in different contexts, it often looks very different to what informed consent looks like in theory. Patient privacy, for example, is a very important value, but it's often very hard to achieve in practice on a patient hospital ward, for example, and it's often achieved in ways which contain certain contradictions and conflict. And we're going to be looking at privacy in relation to AI and data later on in this lecture course. Philosophy can also contribute to debates about the value of the end goals of a practice, as we've seen in relation to the end goal of health, and questions about what exactly is the difference between health and illness, questions which philosophy of medicine asks, and we need to learn from such questions when we look at the general notion of beneficial AI. Philosophy has also contributed to understanding different ways in which understanding disease and disease causation can contribute to emphasising or discovering different solutions. And as we've seen, we need to ask whether in AI and in tech, we're thinking too narrowly about the nature of any problem and its particular solutions. But consider this. We've looked briefly at how codes developed in medical ethics since the Second World War following the Nuremberg doctors' trial have been very influential in helping to develop higher standards of medical practice, and such codes are applied throughout the world. But they were certainly not the first instances of codes of medical ethics. For example, there existed a code of medical ethics earlier, from before World War II, which included the need for consent for patients. And ironically, the country where this particular code shown on the screen here comes from is Germany itself. Here's a circular of the Reich Minister of the Interior, Guidelines for New Therapy and Human Experimentation from Germany in 1931. It distinguished therapeutic from non-therapeutic research. It was based upon an idea that patient autonomy, and it outlined a new legal doctrine of informed consent, and ironically discussed patient dignity and humanity. So it's very often the case that marvellous codes of ethics have been ignored or completely ignored. Here's one of my favourite examples of codes of ethics which were completely ignored. The company Enron, which collapsed with appalling consequences for many, many, many people. In fact, there's a certain irony as well in this slogan with endless possibilities, because where human behaviour is concerned, we don't actually want endless possibilities. We want there to be some limits on what's seen to be possible. As much has been written about Enron, there's a book and a film called The Smartest Guys in the Room. And the smartest guys in the room is obviously used ironically because these people actually had exactly the wrong sorts of smarts. And I'm mentioning Enron because Enron did have a rather fabulous code of ethics, which was completely ignored, sitting on the wall of the office, presumably, where it shouldn't be on the wall of the office. It should be integrated into the conduct of the whole company. When Enron collapsed, they took with them the livelihoods and pensions of hundreds of thousands of people, and the accounting firm Arthur Andersen also disappeared along with them. They had a set of accounting methods which appeared to make it look as if they were doing something which they were not actually doing, producing basically bogus, completely erroneous notions of how well they were achieving. But we must also be a bit careful about using spectacular examples such as Enron, because if we use an example like this, it's easy to think that Enron is an outlier and that other people aren't as bad as them. One of the reasons why Enron was so bad was because they were in a position to cause a huge amount of harm if they did collapse. But one of the things we really ought to be careful about is assuming that there's not similar things happening elsewhere. And in relation to the tech industry, I think it's also important to consider that just as people in the company of Enron were focusing very, very much on certain goals and certain values and had certain sorts of ways of conducting themselves, so we might be wary of many tech companies where, again, there's often a similar mindset and a similar concentration on trying to reduce certain goals. So how can you make people behave in proper ways? It's easier said than done. We looked in a previous lecture at the organisation Algorithm Watch. So Algorithm Watch is drawing up codes of ethics and regulations from around the world, and this is something else that they've done. They've collected these codes and categorised them by sector as to whether or not the agreements that they've been drawn up are recommendations, voluntary commitments, or binding agreements. And this chart says it all. Only 8 out of how many, I don't know, 80 in total, have actually got anything like a binding agreement integrated into them. I mentioned last week as well the IEEE's work on codes of ethics, on ethical issues in autonomous systems. And it's been noted recently that these codes, these guidelines have had very, very poor uptake amongst the tech companies, even though actually many of the big tech companies sent representatives to be part of some of the working parties drawing up the very guidelines and the very discussions about ethics. So as well as codes and regulations and policy, we need to consider what more do we need. And we also need to consider whether or not codes and regulations and policy might, in some instances, do more harm than good. So there's, again, a lot that could be said about this. So here's just one opinion out of many for you to listen to.
One of the striking features, and this goes to your question, John, about the banks, is that they were actually the most regulated entities in the US financial system on the eve of the crisis. People had worried that hedge funds would cause the next financial crisis, or the unregulated derivatives markets. No, it was the highly regulated banks, which a whole bunch of regulators were supposed to be watching over. And it hit me as I was writing The Ascent of Money that the culture of banking had fundamentally changed over the 20 or so years before the financial crisis, from a culture which was based on informal understandings and relatively light supervision in which you tried to do the right thing, to a culture in which you simply complied with the regulation. Are we compliant is a very different question from are we doing the right thing? I read a biography of a man named Sigmund Warburg, a really unusual figure in financial history because he didn't really mean to be a banker. He was really a scholar intellectual who'd become a banker because of the way the Nazis had forced him from his German homeland. And he started over in London, and he built a financial business, S.G. Warburg, that was fundamentally based on his own sense of integrity. And Warburg was the kind of person, if he didn't like the look of somebody, wouldn't do business with them no matter how much money they had. Robert Maxwell walks into Warburg's and walks out again, and Warburg says, we will have nothing to do with that man. That scene in which a moral judgment is made about a potential relationship, that kind of scene had simply ceased to happen on Wall Street by 2006-07. The only question was, are we compliant? Can we do this? Can we do this? Is this okay? And that's a completely different mindset.
So while we're on this subject, let's consider Stanley Milgram's famous obedience to authority experiments. Here's a still from one of the experiments taken in about 1955. These famous experiments have really fallen partly into sort of what you might call pop psychology folklore. And if you've got time, I would actually really recommend reading the whole of Stanley Milgram's book, where he talks about different permutations of the experiment and discusses his own thoughts about what was actually going on. So just to recap, In this experiment, adverts were put out asking for volunteers to come for a small fee to take part in learning and memory experiments. So the subject of the experiment, who didn't know what was going on, was supposed to help somebody to learn a memory task, and every time they made a mistake, to give them an electric shock. Of course, it wasn't actually an electric shock, they were just pretending, because the person who was the learner was just a stooge. And what Milgram found was that many people, by no means all, but many people would carry on delivering the shocks up and over and beyond a level which said danger, even where the person, the stooge, was feigning having heart attacks. So there's been a great deal of work, a great deal of thought given into what was actually going on here and why people carried on obeying. It's also critical and interesting for our purposes to note that Milgram set out to do these experiments precisely because he wished to understand why people had obeyed orders during the Second World War, orders to carry out really atrocious tasks in many instances, or to carry out tasks without really digging too deeply into what actually was going on. And of course, there's been a great deal of discussion about how malleable we are and how much we are going to, how much liable we are to obey authority and how much you can learn from some kind of artificial experiment like this. But there are certain lessons that we can draw that are really particularly important for what we're concerned about in how people might obey codes, and also particular lessons for technology. One of the things that Milgram was concerned about was, well, maybe people are obeying the commands of the experimenter, who just simply, anytime anybody expressed any doubts, just said the experiment must continue. Maybe it's because this is taking place in a setting of Yale University and it's very prestigious, so people really think that they just have got to carry on doing it. So for some of the experiments, he moved to a little dingy basement in an unobtrusive office suite in a sort of nondescript part of town. And there was just a bit of lab equipment and somebody in a grey coat, and discovered that people still carried on delivering shocks in exactly the same, well, I don't know exactly, but more or less the same amount. Significant numbers of people still carried on delivering the shocks. And this is something that I think we might want to think about in relation to technology, that maybe it's simply the trappings of technology and the simple authority of wearing a grey lab coat which is going to make us want to obey. And in particular in relation to the ways in which we're following prompts and commands for our computers all the time. Maybe this says something about human nature, that it just takes a little command, a little prompt, a little refresh button, a little instruction on the computer, and we'll likewise will obey. Likewise, we will give consent for our information to be used in certain ways, and so on and so forth. Milgram also discussed what was it about the people who decided not to obey, who had the strength to say no, they weren't going to carry on delivering shocks. And one of his speculations, one of his thoughts of it, is that if you had a notion of control, a notion of agency, which was strong enough to override the simple sort of polite, socially polite, you've been paid sixpence or whatever it was to do this experiment, so you need to continue, was if you had another source of moral authority which was going to override that. So that he interviewed, for example, a professor of theology who'd refused to continue shocking, who said words to the effect of, "I'm taking orders from a bloke upstairs, not from you." And he also found that if you could see somebody else refusing to shock, then you would be more likely to refuse to shock yourself. So this really says something quite important about how we're going to be influenced by other people. And in relation to notions of surveillance, notions of how we're being watched all the time, and we are being watched, but quite frankly, we are being watched all the time. We are being watched all the time and nudged to do certain things by technology. It's something that's really important to consider. So let's go on to look at another classic experiment from psychology about how much we can be influenced by other people, even to override our own judgments.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2,
2,
3,
3,
3, 3,
But on the third trial, something happens.
2.
2. 2.
2.
2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group info.
That little clip you've just seen is from the famous Asch conformity experiments, which I showed because it is actually quite astonishing. It's actually quite astonishing to see what people agreed under group pressure. And I did psychology as one of my main subjects as my degree, and I remember sort of thinking, how could people be so stupid as to do it? It's just, it actually works. It's actually horrifying to realise. It's actually horrifying to realise how prone to conformity human beings can be. And again, of course, people think, oh, well, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. But I mean, you're a human being as well. I mean, they're just like us. I mean, 1970s haircuts, but I mean, they're just the same as us, really. So there's a great deal of work in social psychology which looks exactly at how people can obey things they shouldn't be obeying, conform to things they shouldn't be conforming to, about how people can be dehumanized as well. I mean, another very famous and actually really quite controversial experiment in this lines of a Stanford prison experiment by Philip Zimbardo, again in the 1970s, whereas I expect most of you know, there was a mock prison set up with guards and prisoners, which was where it led to really quite appalling treatment of the prisoners. And again, the Stanford prison experiment has actually, as a particular experiment, has been particularly controversial, and there's been a lot of controversy late about exactly what the prison guards were told to be doing. So that experiment in particular has come under quite a lot of scrutiny. But the general finding that under certain conditions we can treat each other with great lack of humanity is really, really robust. And it's certainly the case that in prison conditions, for example, the atrocities that went on at Abu Ghraib, and certain conditions are known to, in at least a large subset of human beings, to produce really quite appalling behaviour. Now, this is going to have great repercussions for lots of things going on in AI. It's also going to have great repercussions for actually how a lot of the AI and the technology that we're using now is affecting how we relate to each other, the ways in which it might be making us closer in some ways, and the ways in which it might be distancing us from each other, through a way in which we communicate. So, for example, the way in which so many people now are communicating online, in one way connects you to other people, but in another way actually cuts us off from quite a lot of what's going on in human contact. So in this one of these last slides here, I've got the woman who stopped the Stanford prison experiment, Christina Majlak, who was another psychologist who was actually Philip Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time. And he had the sense to marry her, actually, because after the prison experiment had been going on for 3 or 4 days, she went round to see what was going to visit him and took one look at it and said to him, "What on earth is going on here?" And at that point, he called the whole experiment off. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is a really critical finding in social science about what makes people behave badly, in the same sort of way as you can conform to a group. If somebody from the outside of a group, or if you go into a different setting, you can see things from a different angle and suddenly realise, uh-oh, this is really terrible, or we shouldn't be doing things in quite this kind of way. It's something to think about, particularly also in the tech world, in the way in which the technology that we use through computing attracts our attention, focuses on our attention in certain ways, narrows us onto looking at certain things, narrows us into, we find ourselves part of certain groups online, narrowing opinion, but also in the way in which companies may work, in technology companies may work. A lot of the big tech firms, for example, especially, well, they've all got so much money, you can more or less live inside the bubble of your company. There's fitness regimes, there's showers, there's fantastic, there's table football, there's pool machines, there's swimming pools, there's fantastic food. You can really live in a bubble inside an institution, inside a corporation, whereby you can easily, in any instance like that, you can easily get narrowed into having a certain focus. And it's really a robust finding in social science that you need to have more than one focus, more than one peer group, if you like, or the ability to step back and reflect. And the enormously long work hours of many people working in the technology industry, or in lots of areas now, the enormously long work hours are actually, there's very good reason to think that's very, very detrimental to making good ethical decisions. There are extremely long work hours and cultures in Enron, for example. So to reflect, you can see it's gone dark. That's because something happened to the first recording and I must have pressed the mute button or something. I have to done this little bit again. Just to reflect on what we've looked at in this lecture. We need to consider what specifically philosophy as a discipline has to add to debates about achieving ethics in practice, but also see that it's absolutely essential that we look far and wide at other disciplines and at not just the individual, but the social and the institutional setting. It's also interesting to consider what makes a question a philosophical question and what the boundaries of a subject are. We need to consider what knowledge from other areas of professional ethics you can bring into our discussion. So, of course, anybody listening or thinking about this may well have knowledge from other areas, and it's going to be really interesting and useful to bring it in. We can consider what aspects of ethical goals and guidance from other areas can be brought into AI and data ethics. And also, I think we need to consider the impact of technology itself upon how we approach and address ethical questions. So there's a third part coming to this section of a class on practical ethics guidance and policy. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next class.